and his Chinese counterpart, Wang Wentao, have vowed to keep up talks ahead of next month's EU-China summit. The pair met on the margins of the OECD Council meeting in Paris on Tuesday. The EU says its priority remains rebalancing the trade relationship and levelling the playing field. There you go. It comes ahead of a meeting later this morning with the very busy Mr. Šefčovič and his American counterpart, the equally busy Jameson Greer, in Paris, with trade ties between the bloc and America top of the agenda. Let's be brutally honest. Well, Jason Oxman is President and CEO, Information Technology Industry Council as well. And Jason, just a bit of context, you represent some massive names, including the likes of TSMC, NVIDIA and Apple, don't you?
We are fortunate to represent 80 of the world's largest technology companies, all of which are keenly interested in the continuation of that transatlantic relationship.
So, okay, well, let me ask you perhaps the most basic question you're going to get asked today before the sophisticated ones come in from my colleague on my right. What is the key issue regarding technology that would thwart an improvement in relationships between EU and the United States? Is it the DMA? What is it?
Well, the DMA has been law for some time, as have a number of other EU trade measures. Well, he talks about it in the context of how U.S. companies are treated in Europe, and of course, U.S. companies are a key component of the transatlantic trade relationship. $1 trillion worth of goods trade, but importantly, close to $400 billion in digital trade between the U.S. and the EU. So that's a really important market.
Okay, let me ask the second basic question. It's okay for the DOJ or for various legal jurisdictions in the States to bemoan the oligopolistic, I said it, there you go, oligopolistic behaviour, don't try it again, behaviour of these companies. But when it comes to the Europeans bemoaning the monopolistic, there you go, that's easier, behaviour of them as well, they seem to take affront as well. It's okay for American legal jurisdiction to have a go at these companies, but they get affronted when the Europeans do it, it seems.
Well, I think the concern that's been expressed is that the regulatory environment in Europe generally is not conducive to a lot of investment. And that's something that the EU itself, through the Draghi report, has been examining. And they have a simplification regime that's underway right now, an analysis of those regulations to make sure it's not deterring investment. Of course, investment is important to innovation, and innovation is important to economic growth. So I think that simplification analysis that they have underway is going to be enormously important to make sure that new laws that are coming online, like the AI Act that's being implemented right now, don't deter investment, both by European companies and by global companies as well.
This is a great point, isn't it? Because I was astounded that the landmark legislation that Europe is so proud of and that it thinks that the rest of the world should be implementing, GDPR, could actually be very negative for AI in future because it hampers the ability to collect data and then train up systems. So to your point around self-help for the Europeans to come up with the right legislation, they must be somewhat wary here. Pushback from the United States, even their own brilliant legislation, could be negative in future. So do you see much of a change in the European Union to come up with better policy, or at least less policy?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. GDPR requires, by its mandate, that you use as little data as possible. The AI Act has exactly the opposite provision. It says you have to use as much data as possible to program your AI to make sure it's comprehensive and not discriminatory. That's the problem that Draghi highlighted in his report. The simplification agenda requires the EU to look at these bodies of law in conjunction with another. And what you're seeing now is calls for delay in implementation of the AI Act for exactly the reason you mentioned. There are these different and sometimes conflicting obligations that cause companies to say, including European companies, to say, I might have to delay my implementation in order to find out what the rules are. You saw Apple make an announcement a few months ago they were going to delay implementation of the AI provisions of the iPhone because they weren't sure what the regime was going to be. And of course, you have 27 different member states that are in charge of enforcement of a regime that we don't yet know what the rules are. So it is enormously complicated, and it requires the EU to really revisit the deployment of, for example, the AI code of conduct that they're working on right now before requiring companies to follow rules they don't necessarily understand.
So if we get into the weeds of how tariffs are getting in the way of doing business for technology companies now, let's talk about that, because there are deep technology relationships, and you can see that with just about every deal on the planet that NVIDIA has inked with European companies. There are big cross connections with Microsoft as well. I mean, there's a ton of American tech in Europe at this stage. There's also been a level of compliance around the U.S. CHIPS Act, where the U.S. has mandated what sort of access other countries should be able to get to some of the technology in Europe, and ASML is a great example of that. How much of this falls apart because of the Trump administration's aggressive push now on trade, and how much of the supply chains are now impacted by trade tariffs?
Yeah, I think the Trump administration has actually undone a lot of those rules that you referenced, including the restrictions on European companies' access to that U.S. technology that's so important for AI. The Biden administration had a so-called AI diffusion rule that the Trump administration overturned that makes that access a lot easier. Look, this transatlantic trade relationship is enormously important. It's the most comprehensive trade relationship on the planet, and technology is at the core of it. Tariffs are, of course, not helpful to that trading relationship, and our hope is that the conversations that are happening in Paris today between the EU and the U.S. will lead to the kind of comprehensive trade deal that eliminates those tariffs. Tariffs have been used as a negotiating tool, and unfortunately what ends up happening is the escalation ends up with a tit for tat that isn't helpful to those trade negotiations that we need to see move forward. So hopefully we'll move those forward.
Jason, this isn't 2D, though. This is about, to put it simply, and it's not simple, one thing that the American administration clearly wants in order to get big deals over the line with the EU is also a commitment to exclude the Chinese as well, to a certain degree, whether it be the steel industry with the UK exemption, whether it be the IT industry with the sale of technology to the Chinese. We've seen it, as you mentioned, with ASML as well. How important is the relationship for the US tech companies with China compared to what they might lose if indeed the EU gets a deal over the line with America?
I think that's what's interesting about the previous administration's restrictions on the sale of U.S. technology to China. What does that say to China? You just have to develop your own ecosystem and make it available to the rest of the world. It not only denies U.S. and European companies...
Which is bonkers, yeah?
It is bonkers. It's exactly the opposite of what you want.
On this. Well, let's hold on, because this is really important. The Biden administration made the same mistakes that the Trump administration made before it and is making now, and that is you think that if you ring-fence technology, diffusion isn't going to happen. It's nuts, isn't it?
It is, and in fact it provides an economic incentive for that exact diffusion to happen.
Stop copying and actually start innovating.
That's right, and that's why I think the Trump administration is moving in the right direction. You saw it in the Middle East less than 2 weeks ago with $1 trillion in deals announced there, making clear that the Trump administration is obviously focused on investing in manufacturing in the U.S., but also wants to give U.S. companies opportunities around the world. And you've seen announcements from European companies investing in the Middle East and the United States as well. So this relationship is really important, and as you noted, China is at the center of it because it is a national security threat both to the EU and the U.S., and we need to make sure that we're working together to counter that threat.
Yeah, it did sound like the U.S. President was gifting another source of revenue to some of those big technology companies away from China on those big deals. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Jason Oxman with us, President and CEO, Information Technology Industry Council. Plenty coming up on the show, opportunities and risks around